The carriage wheels had barely stilled when she stepped down, unmarried, unprotected, and uninvited. Under the grey winter skies of London, Miss Lillian Harrow crossed the threshold of Wexham House, not as a guest, but as a servant. Inside, silence reigned. The Duke did not smile, the daughters did not speak, and somewhere in the shadows of the nursery, a memory refused to die. What secret lies hidden beneath velvet curtains and mourning veils? What happens when duty demands silence, but desire whispers louder? Welcome to a story where class divides, grief lingers, and love must choose between permission and passion. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you listening from? And what is it about historical romances that forever captures your heart? Wexham House, on the edge of Kensington, London, England, winter of 1852. The sky wept in silence as the hired carriage creaked up the gravel drive, its wheels sinking slightly into the mud left by days of relentless rain. Pale fog hovered just above the hedgerows, like ghosts reluctant to leave the earth. The towering silhouette of Wexham House emerged from the mist, its stone facade streaked with cold, its windows shuttered against both weather and sentiment. It was not a place that welcomed. It endured. Inside the coach, Miss Lillian Harrow, aged 27, sat with her gloved hands resting motionless atop a worn leather satchel. Her figure was slender, upright despite the cold, and her woolen gown, faded navy, neatly brushed, spoke of a woman accustomed to dignity in hardship. A dark cloak, fastened with a simple iron clasp, draped her shoulders. Her chestnut-brown hair was pinned tightly at the nape of her neck beneath a modest lace cap, not a single strand escaping. Only her eyes betrayed her stillness, green as sea glass and heavy with things unsaid. The door of the carriage was opened not by a footman, but by the house steward, an older man whose expression bore the same chill as the house itself. He said nothing as he stepped back, allowing her to descend. No one offered to take her hand. No voice welcomed her. Only the brittle crunch of gravel underfoot and the low groan of the great doors swinging open. She crossed the threshold into Wexham House with quiet resolve. The air inside was colder than it had any right to be, despite the fire lit in the distant hearth. Shadows clung to the corners of the high-ceilinged hall, where heavy portraits stared down like silent judges. A gas lamp flickered overhead, its glow dim and hesitant, as if uncertain whether to shine at all. At the far end of the corridor stood the Duke of Wexham, Edward Montgomery, a tall, broad-shouldered man, cloaked in charcoal black. He did not move as she approached. He wore no smile, no sign of pleasantry. Only his eyes, pale blue and rimmed with exhaustion, acknowledged her presence. He was every inch the widower, immaculate in appearance but hollowed by absence. "Miss Harrow," he said simply. His voice was low, clipped, controlled. "You are expected." She curtsied with precise decorum. "Your Grace." There was no conversation beyond that. He motioned to the steward, who escorted her through a series of corridors, each quieter than the last. No laughter, no running footsteps, not even the rustle of skirts or the clink of porcelain. Only silence, thick, oppressive, and complete. The nursery was at the end of the north wing, where the light struggled hardest to reach. The room was tidy, untouched. 2 small beds, 2 delicate wardrobes, 1 cold hearth. There, seated stiffly on a chaise, were the girls. Beatrice, 9, with her golden curls tied back in dark ribbons, observed Lillian with a guarded, almost adult stillness. Her blue-grey eyes were steady, measuring. Her hands, gloved despite the indoors, folded precisely in her lap. Alice, 7, smaller, frailer, sat closer to the window, clutching a ribboned toy to her chest. Her ash-brown curls were unbrushed, her boots scuffed. She did not raise her eyes. Her silence was not caution. It was retreat. Lillian stood in the doorway and felt the full weight of their grief. She said nothing. She merely stepped inside, placed her satchel down, and sat gently in the wooden chair near the bookshelf. "I will read," she said softly, more to the room than to its occupants. Her voice was quiet, musical, unforced. She opened a small, leather-bound volume of fairy tales, the same she had once read aloud to a dying mother. Her fingers trembled only once as she turned the page. She read of forests and lost princesses, of broken spells and longing hearts. She did not look up, she did not press. Halfway through the tale, Alice stirred. A small, almost imperceptible shift, and then a glance, a single upward glance from those dark blue eyes, fleeting but unmistakable. Lillian did not react. She only continued reading, her voice like breath through lace. When the story ended, the room remained silent, but something had changed. Slightly, subtly. A thread of breath through a sealed chamber. That evening, in the drawing room, where firelight barely touched the curtains, Lady Margaret Ashcombe descended like a winter wind. She was a woman carved of duty, all bone and lace, with eyes sharp enough to slice. "You will remember your station, Miss Harrow," she said, her cane tapping once against the floor for emphasis. "They are his daughters, not yours. And you are not here to be noticed." Lillian nodded. "Of course, my lady." Lady Margaret studied her with unsettling precision. "There are dangers in this house. Not all of them speak." When Lillian returned to the nursery that night, she found the girls already in bed, their eyes closed, but not truly sleeping. She sat again in her chair, opened the book once more, and whispered a story not meant to be heard, but meant to be felt. In that house where mourning ruled, and whispers held more weight than words, a quiet stranger had entered. And in her silence, she brought something unexpected, the beginning of a change. The mornings in Wexham House arrived not with sunshine, but with the slow groan of frost lifting from the windows. The fog lingered like an old ache, clinging to the glass panes and muffling the light that struggled to enter. The nursery remained a quiet kingdom, its rhythms marked by the soft brushing of hair, the folding of blankets, and the turning of book pages. Yet something had begun to stir, an almost imperceptible shift, like the tremble of leaves before a storm. Lillian Harrow, in her simple brown wool gown and white collar freshly starched, moved through the nursery with a quiet grace. She did not command. She invited. She read with soft cadence, sang lullabies not meant to be heard by all ears, and touched only when welcome. The daughters of the Duke, Beatrice 9 and Alice 7, were still hesitant, still cloaked in mourning, but their silence no longer felt like refusal. It felt like listening. On the third evening of her stay, as a fire crackled low in the hearth, and the air inside the nursery grew thick with the scent of lavender oil, Lillian heard it. A hum, faint, barely more than breath, but distinct. Alice, curled beneath a woolen blanket, was humming the melody Lillian had sung not an hour before. Just a few notes, no words, but it was enough to still the air. Lillian did not react. She simply continued to fold the linens in her lap, her fingers trembling beneath the fabric. She did not speak of it, not to Beatrice, not to the staff, not even to herself aloud. She stored the moment away, like a precious letter never to be sent. In the long, quiet afternoons, Lillian ventured through the corridors of the North Wing, careful never to intrude where she was not summoned. Yet her path often crossed another's. He who owned the silence, the Duke of Wexham, Edward Montgomery, was a man of precision. He rose early, took tea in solitude, and retreated to his study with stacks of correspondence that no longer held the urgency they once did. He spoke little to the staff, and even less to his daughters, but Lillian began to notice his presence in the oddest of places. Once she passed the open door to the drawing room and caught sight of him standing before the portrait of his late wife. He did not weep. He did not speak. He simply stared, eyes fixed upon the canvas, with a hollowness that suggested he was not seeing the image, but the absence beyond it. Another time, she encountered him at the far end of the garden path, where the frost had turned every rosebush into a crystalline cage. He did not acknowledge her, only nodded. But in that moment, Lillian saw the faintest shift in his expression. Not warmth, not recognition, but perhaps the ache of remembering what warmth had once felt like. He was mourning in stillness, and yet Lillian could not help but sense a current of something beneath it. something tightly coiled, like a spring never released. The staff spoke of him rarely. When they did, it was with tones of caution, almost reverence. "His Grace prefers order," whispered the housemaid as she handed Lillian fresh linens. "He does not tolerate questions." And yet, he tolerated her. He did not summon her, but neither did he send her away. On a grey afternoon, heavy with the scent of coal smoke and snow, Lillian found herself kneeling beside Alice's bed, adjusting the blankets. The child was asleep, her cheek resting on a threadbare doll with a blue ribbon tied at its neck. As Lillian tucked the covers beneath her small frame, something caught her eye beneath the bed, a glint of metal, half hidden in the shadows. She reached beneath and carefully withdrew a small wooden box, intricately carved with wildflowers. The lock had long since broken, and when she opened it, a soft gasp escaped her lips. Inside lay a collection of trinkets, a silver thimble, a silk handkerchief embroidered with the letter C, a dried sprig of lavender, and most poignantly, a miniature portrait of the late Duchess, smiling faintly in a locket worn by time. The scent of her perfume still lingered faintly on the fabric. Faded, but not gone. Lillian closed the lid gently, holding it to her chest. She sat beside the bed, the box resting in her lap. When Beatrice entered the room moments later, book in hand, she froze upon seeing it. "That was hers," the child said softly. Her voice was clear, trembling. Lillian looked up. "I believe it was. Alice had it tucked away." Beatrice hesitated. Then, in a rare act of closeness, she walked forward and sat beside Lillian. "She would tell us stories," she whispered. "But they stopped making sense at the end. She said she'd come back as a bird." Lillian's throat tightened. She did not offer platitudes, only silence, and a hand placed gently atop Beatrice's own. "That may be true," Lillian said after a moment. "Some birds return in spring, even after the harshest winters." That evening, Alice whispered her sister's name in her sleep, and Lillian stood at the window long after they had both drifted off, gazing out at the garden covered in frost, wondering whether the Duke's heart might one day thaw. But just as the night quieted into embers, the silence was broken elsewhere. Far from Wexham House, in a lamplit club in Mayfair filled with smoke and the perfume of ambition, a man leaned back in his chair and unfolded a letter. Lord Thomas Elridge, 31, carefully groomed and painfully aware of his own charm, scanned the page with a slow smile. The name Lillian Harrow glared at him from the parchment like a ghost summoned too soon. "Well," he murmured, fingers tapping the paper with predatory interest. "What a curious placement." He folded the letter and tucked it into his coat, rising with the elegance of a man who had spent his life escaping consequence. In the shadows of London, the past had begun to stir. Back at Wexham House, Lillian returned the carved box to its hiding place, brushing the dust from her skirts. She would not mention it to the Duke. Not yet. Some griefs needed to be touched gently, like bruises beneath silk, and as she sat down once more to read a quiet story to girls still caught between sorrow and dawn, a wind passed through the nursery window. Soft, cold, but carrying with it the scent of change. The frost had grown bolder. It climbed the stone walls like ivy and clung to the windows with stubborn fingers, drawing lacework across the panes. The sky outside remained the colour of pewter, and yet within the walls of Wexham House, something delicate had begun to tremble into life. That morning, as the governess brushed out Beatrice's golden curls, the silence that had ruled the nursery for so long was broken, not by accident or sleep, but by choice. "She doesn't like the soup," Beatrice whispered, her voice hoarse, as if unused. The brush froze in Lillian Harrow's hand. She did not turn. She did not gasp. She merely lowered the brush with quiet reverence, as if the sentence had been a sacred rite. "I understand," Lillian murmured, placing the brush down on the vanity. "I shall speak to the cook." Beatrice's gaze met hers in the mirror. No one smiled, but something passed between them. Acknowledgement, trust, perhaps even the first bloom of something deeper. The servants noticed first. The footman tripped over his words at lunch. The scullery maid dropped a spoon when she overheard laughter, actual laughter, coming from the nursery, light and fleeting like a bird startled from a branch. The air of the house, so long bound in mourning, now felt uncertain, as if the furniture itself had begun to listen again. The change did not go unnoticed by His Grace, the Duke of Wexham. He entered the nursery just before tea that day, unannounced. Lilian stood near the fireplace arranging a set of books for the girls. She turned at once, curtsying with practiced grace. Beatrice and Alice rose from their seats, eyes wide but unafraid. The Duke looked at them, at his daughters, then at her. "They speak," he said, his tone low, unreadable. Lilian's hands rested atop a book of fables. "Yes, Your Grace." He was silent for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside, a raven cawed once, then flew across the grey sky beyond the nursery window. "My thanks," he said finally. "Miss Harrow." And then he lingered, not inappropriately, not noticeably perhaps to any passer-by, but Lilian felt it in the air, the way his eyes did not immediately return to the girls, the way they remained fixed upon her face as if searching for something. She lowered her gaze and offered a gentle nod, her pulse like thunder beneath her stays. He left without another word. That night in the drawing room, the conversation turned to the season's charitable obligations. It was Lady Margaret Ashcombe, wrapped in a shawl of black lace and smelling faintly of violets and vinegar, who raised the subject with clinical precision. "It has been over a year," she announced, without looking up from her embroidery. "The time for self-imposed exile has passed." The Duke, seated in a leather armchair by the fire, said nothing. The light from the hearth traced the angles of his face, deepening the shadows beneath his eyes. Lady Margaret continued, her needle plunging mercilessly into the fabric. "The Foundlings Society holds their annual gala this Saturday. The committee expects your attendance. A donation has been pledged in your name." "I did not authorize any pledge," Edward replied, his voice cold. "You did not forbid it either." She paused. "Your absence only fans the gossip. It is time the world sees you standing again, even if it is only to remind them that you still can." He looked into the fire. "I will not go," he said. Lady Margaret raised a single eyebrow, but did not argue further. Her point had been made, her silence now the sharper blade. Later that evening, as Lilian walked the girls through their evening prayers, she passed the corridor just outside the study. The light was dim, cast by a single wall sconce, and the air smelled faintly of tobacco and leather. She did not intend to stop, but he was there, standing at the open door, watching her, not hidden, not ashamed. She paused. "Miss Harrow," he said, his voice softer than she had heard it before. "Your Grace," she replied. For a moment, neither moved. The air between them was tight with something unnamed. His gaze did not hold command, but inquiry, a question that had not yet taken form. "They've changed," he said. "They were always capable," she replied. "They were simply waiting to be safe." He nodded slowly. "My aunt wishes me to attend the Foundlings' Gala," he said, not quite knowing why he had confessed it to her. Lilian's voice was quiet. "Will you?" He hesitated. "I have not the heart for society." She stepped closer, her hands folded at her waist. Her cloak was draped over one arm, her bonnet loosely tied. She had just come from putting the girls to bed, and the scent of lavender clung to her like a whisper. "Then go for your daughters," she said gently. "Let them see that grief does not have to be a prison, that it can be carried and still allow life to continue." His expression shifted. His brow furrowed, and he looked at her, truly looked, as if her words had cracked something open inside him. "I do not belong there anymore," he whispered. Her voice was almost inaudible. "Perhaps none of us do, but sometimes we must step into the firelight, if only so the cold doesn't win." For the briefest instant, he looked as though he might reach for her. His hand twitched at his side, but he did not move. Instead, he nodded once, curt and sharp, as if sealing a contract he had not meant to sign. The next day, the household awoke to news that the Duke would attend the gala. The preparations were swift and quiet. The tailor arrived by noon. The carriage was ordered polished. The household stirred with cautious excitement, the kind born from long dormancy. Lillian, for her part, said nothing. She stood at the nursery window that afternoon, watching the snow gather gently on the hedges. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of tea, gone cold. Beatrice sat at the table colouring. Alice lay on the rug with her doll tucked beneath her arm, humming a lullaby that Lillian had once whispered into the night. The house had not changed, but something within it had, and in the silence of the corridor, the memory of a glance lingered like a secret neither of them dared name. It was not love, not yet, but it was something just as dangerous, just as tender, the first flicker of a flame no one dared to light. The day of the gala arrived wrapped in mist, as if the city itself wished to veil what was to come. Carriages rattled along the cobbled streets of Belgrave Square, their wheels splashing through slush and their windows frosted with breath. Lanterns glowed like cautious stars behind glass, illuminating gentlemen in tailored wool and ladies swathed in silks, velvets and lace. Music spilled from the grand houses in waves, waltzes that promised ease, smiles that masked strategies, eyes that watched more than they ever spoke. At Wexham House, the air was no less tense. The Duke's carriage stood ready in the courtyard, polished to a mirror sheen. The footman wore fresh gloves, and Lady Margaret's diamond brooch had been pinned precisely to the centre of her bodice, just below her severe white lace collar. But it was Lillian Harrow who had stolen the breath of the household that evening, though no one said so aloud. She descended the stairs in silence, her modest gown the colour of stormy lilac, with sleeves trimmed in the faintest ivory lace. The dress was not new. It had belonged to Lady Margaret decades ago, but it had been altered with care. It clung not tightly but gracefully, suggesting elegance without vanity. Her hair was pulled into a low chignon, a few tendrils escaping by her ears, softening her delicate features. She wore no jewels, no gloves, just the strength of her bearing and the tremor she kept hidden beneath her ribs. "You will remain at the edge of the room," Lady Margaret instructed as they rode through the gaslit streets. "Observe the children. Speak only when necessary. You are not a guest." Lillian nodded. "Yes, my lady." But something in her voice betrayed her calm. A note of quiet courage. Lady Margaret's eyes narrowed. "And do not look at him too long." Lillian said nothing. The ballroom of the Devonshire Club was a vision of chandeliers and polished floors. Gold and white panelling framed high walls, and swaths of silk draped the windows like the hems of gowns, too fine for walking. Laughter rang like bells. Gloves brushed hands. Fans fluttered like secrets passed from one breath to another. Lillian stood near a marble column, half in shadow, watching the crowd move like water. She felt no envy, only detachment. These were not her people. They never had been. And yet, when Edward Montgomery, Duke of Wexham, entered the room, the air shifted. He wore black, immaculate, severe and striking. His frock coat was tailored with military precision, his cravat tied so crisply it might have drawn blood. He spoke little, bowed sparingly, and yet his presence filled the room like a storm not yet broken. Lillian watched him from her place in the wings, her heart beating with treacherous rhythm. She told herself it was admiration, nothing more. He did not see her at first, but when he did, the change in his expression was subtle, yet unmistakable. He crossed the floor slowly, deliberately, as if drawn by something he could neither name nor resist. "Miss Harrow," he said, stopping just shy of impropriety. "Your Grace," she answered, lowering her gaze slightly, though her eyes burned with the effort of looking at him. He glanced at her dress, his voice lower. "That color suits you." "I would not have chosen it," she said softly, "but perhaps that is why it works." He allowed the ghost of a smile. "Do you find the evening tolerable?" "I find it delicate," she replied. "Like standing in a room full of mirrors and hoping no one sees what you truly are." The silence between them pulsed. "You are seen," he said. Her breath caught, just enough to make her forget what silence felt like, but their moment was short-lived. A voice, familiar in its charm and sharpened like a blade in velvet, interrupted from behind. Well, some faces simply refused to disappear. Lillian froze. She turned slowly to find Lord Thomas Elridge, resplendent in midnight blue, his waistcoat threaded with gold, and his smirk as polished as his boots. "Miss Harrow," he said, bowing far lower than necessary. "Or is it Miss something else now? I confess I've lost track." She curtsied, her spine stiff. "My name has not changed, nor has your talent for turning up in the most fascinating company." His gaze flicked to the Duke and back. "You've risen." Edward's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Lillian did not flinch. "I came as a chaperone, not a guest." Thomas's smile curled. "Titles are fluid, as is reputation." The insult floated between them like smoke. Lady Margaret appeared then, sudden as thunder. "Lord Elridge," she said coldly, "there's a stain on your collar, or is it your character?" He laughed unbothered and tipped his head. "Ah, Lady Margaret, ever the sentinel." He turned back to Lillian and lowered his voice. "Some ghosts should stay buried, my dear. The living have so much more to lose." He walked away without waiting for a reply. Edward looked at her then, and there was something raw in his eyes, something unspoken, unfinished, but propriety wrapped around them like a noose. He could say nothing. Not here. So Lillian lowered her eyes and stepped back into shadow. The remainder of the evening passed in quiet turmoil. She did not speak again to the Duke. He danced once, with the daughter of an earl, then retreated. Lillian stood at the edge of the room until her feet ached and her thoughts screamed. When the gala ended and the carriage doors closed around them once more, Lady Margaret turned to her, her voice sharper than cold. "You will not speak of tonight. Not of him, and certainly not of that man." Lillian nodded, but in her chest, shame and fury warred in silence. The next morning the rumors began. They drifted through Mayfair like perfume, sickly sweet and clinging. Whispers of a governess with an interesting past, a nobleman's charity reaching too far, a widow's replacement before the morning crepe had even been lifted, and behind it all, Lord Elridge's smile, lingering like poison spilled in silk. The house remained quiet, but the walls had begun to listen. The rain returned with an insistence that felt almost personal. It tapped against the tall windows of Wexham House like a persistent memory and clung to the corners of the stone facade as if unwilling to let go. Inside, the air had grown heavier again, more cautious, more watchful, as though the brief thaw of joy that had crept in after the gala now feared it had come too soon. In the nursery, silence reigned once more, not the gentle quiet of concentration, but the kind of stillness born of tension. Alice, once willing to speak in fragments, had grown mute again. Her doll sat untouched, her ribboned hair hung loose over her shoulders. She no longer sang, even in sleep. Lillian's voice, soft, melodic, steady, now echoed in the emptiness rather than stirring comfort. And Beatrice, who had taken to her governess with guarded hope, watched her closely now. Her questions had dwindled. Her posture was taut. She looked not at Lillian's hands or eyes, but at the shadows behind her, because something had changed. That morning, the front door had opened too early. Thomas Elridge had arrived without announcement, his gloves still damp from the rain, his boots spotless despite the storm. He removed his hat with exaggerated courtesy and offered it to the steward as though he were an invited guest. No name had been given at the gate, no permission granted. But he had walked in all the same, wearing entitlement like a medal. The household had not seen him in years. But Lillian had never truly stopped feeling his presence, like a page left unburned in a chapter she had tried to forget. She was in the east corridor near the library when he found her. "Miss Harrow," he said, his voice low, his smile sharp. "You've acquired taste." Lillian turned, every muscle in her spine stiffening. She kept her tone flat. "You have no right to be here." "Is that so?" He stepped forward. "And yet here I am." His gloved fingers brushed the edge of a shelf idly, as though measuring the dust. "You walk the halls of dukes now, attend society balls. I must say your ascent is impressive." She met his gaze. "You should leave." "But we have unfinished business," he murmured, his voice velvet over steel. "Unless you'd rather I take it to the Duke himself. I wonder what he'd say if he knew the truth behind your father's tragic end. Or your association with a man who once forged letters in a bishop's name." Lillian's breath caught. Thomas leaned in, lowering his voice to a hush. "You owe me, Lillian. Not in coin, in silence, and you've cost me more than you know." "I owe you nothing," she hissed, her composure cracking. "Oh, but you do. And if you won't offer loyalty, I might instead offer the full story to Mayfair. A governess with a ruined name. How charming. How scandalous. I imagine the Duke would be most displeased." A voice echoed from the corridor behind them. "Miss Harrow." It was Edward. He stood at the far end of the hallway, his expression unreadable, his presence like thunder in the wrong season. His gaze flicked from Lillian to Elridge, his jaw clenched. "My apologies," Thomas said, stepping back with exaggerated civility. "I was just leaving." And he did, slowly, smoothly, as if the encounter had been no more than a casual exchange. Edward said nothing. Lillian stood frozen. "I should return to the nursery," she said at last, not looking at him. He nodded once, curtly, but the air between them had thickened, hardened. That evening, Edward did not appear at dinner. No message was sent, no explanation offered. The door to his study remained closed, and Lillian, for the first time since her arrival, felt cold. She could see it in the way the staff averted their eyes, in the way Lady Margaret's lips pressed tighter than usual, in the way the silence inside the nursery returned like a cruel trick. Alice would not speak, would not hum, would not look at her. And Beatrice, who had once placed a small hand in hers without fear, now sat with folded arms and averted eyes. At dusk, Lillian stood before the window of her room, watching rain snake down the glass. She was wrapped in her shawl, her fingers trembling beneath the folds. The house had turned again, like a tide pulling back just when one dared to wade in. She thought of packing. She thought of walking out the same door Thomas had used, with her head high and her heart shattered. But before she could act, a knock sounded at her chamber door. She opened it to find Beatrice, pale and flushed from having run up the stairs. "Don't go," the girl said, her voice breaking. "Please." Lillian knelt before her. "Who told you I was leaving?" "No one," Beatrice said, tears clinging to her lashes. "But I can feel it, and if you leave, Alice won't come back. I know it." Lillian pulled the girl into her arms, closing her eyes. For a long moment, neither moved. Later that night, another knock came, but this one was sharp, brisk, and unmistakable. Lady Margaret stood at the threshold, dressed in a gown of black satin, her face a map of lines etched by pride, disappointment, and a fierce kind of loyalty. "May I enter?" she asked. Lillian stepped aside. The elder woman sat near the fireplace, her cane resting against her skirts. "I knew your father," she said. Lillian's heart stopped. He was a man of uncommon intelligence and too much trust. He believed he could outwit his own ruin. He could not. Lillian sat across from her, breath shallow. "I also knew about Thomas Elridge, not the details, but enough." "Then why?" Lillian's voice cracked. "Why allow me here?" Lady Margaret met her eyes. "Because strength is not always born in drawing rooms. Sometimes it rises from disgrace. I see your strength, Miss Harrow, and I see your restraint, which is more than I can say for most women in society." Tears welled, unbidden. Lady Margaret continued, her tone softening. "You are not beneath this house, and you are not your father's name. True nobility," she said, rising slowly, "does not come from blood. It comes from endurance." She moved toward the door, then paused. "Stay." Then she left, and Lillian, alone in the quiet flicker of firelight, wept without sound, because someone had finally seen her. Not her shame, but her worth. The snow came quietly that morning, drifting down like ashes from a long-forgotten fire. It clung to the hedgerows and rested gently atop the wrought-iron gates of Wexham House, softening the sharpness of winter's grief. The garden, once rigid and colourless, now lay beneath a silvery hush, as if time itself had paused to listen. Lillian Harrow stood beneath the archway, leading from the East Conservatory, her shawl pulled tight against the cold, her breath rising in visible puffs. She had come in search of stillness, of silence that did not weigh like judgment. Her boots crunched lightly over the frost-kissed path as she wandered into the garden. The air bit at her cheeks, turning them pink beneath her pale skin. But she welcomed the sting. It reminded her she was alive. She had not expected to see him. Edward Montgomery, the Duke of Wexham, stood beside the marble bench where his late wife had once sat reading poetry aloud to their daughters. His posture was as still as the statues surrounding the fountain, his hands gloved, folded behind his back. Snow dotted the dark shoulders of his wool coat and clung to the brim of his top hat, but he did not seem to notice. Lillian stopped short. She should have turned back. She should have stepped away before he saw her. But she didn't. He turned slowly, his gaze meeting hers across the distance, as though he had felt her presence before seeing it. They stood that way for a long moment, two figures in a garden of ghosts. She lowered her eyes respectfully and was about to retreat when his voice stopped her. "Miss Harrow." It was not a command. It was not even a question. It was an invitation. She stepped forward slowly, her steps careful on the icy path, her shawl trailing slightly behind her like a forgotten whisper. When she reached him, she stood beside the bench, but did not sit. "I didn't know you came here," she said softly. He looked straight ahead. "Not often, but there are days I find I must." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but full, like a breath waiting to be released. "I owe you an apology," he said after a pause. She looked at him. "For what, Your Grace?" "For listening to a man I knew to be a snake," he replied, his jaw tense, "and for allowing silence to take the place of judgment." She hesitated. Then, "You did not know, but I should have asked." The wind stirred gently between them, sending flurries into the air like powdered glass. Lillian turned her face toward the stone fountain, now frozen over. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "My father," she began, "was a clergyman, a kind man. Too kind. He trusted men who wore titles like armor. One of them was Thomas Elridge." Edward turned slightly toward her but said nothing. "He forged a letter. My father signed it in good faith. It was used to deceive the bishop and steal from the poor. When the truth surfaced, Thomas vanished. My father could not bear the weight of disgrace. He drank poison behind the chapel." Edward inhaled sharply, but she continued. "I was 19, alone. The engagement was broken without a word. The house sold, the staff dismissed. The neighbors crossed to the other side of the road when they saw me." She turned to face him now, her green eyes holding his. "I never came to your home to steal favor or position or affection. I came because I had nowhere else to go, and because your daughters needed someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and still rise the next day." Edward did not move. His eyes searched her face, as if seeing her for the first time. He reached, just slightly, his hand lifted, gloved and uncertain, hovering in the air between them. Then he stopped, not because he did not want to touch her, but because he knew that to do so would be to unravel everything that held them apart. She saw it, the tremor of restraint in his shoulders, the war in his gaze. "I'm not asking you to see me differently," she said, her voice steady. "Only to see me as I am." He lowered his hand, slowly. "And what I see," he said, quietly, "is a woman braver than I have ever been." Lillian's breath caught, but neither of them spoke again. They stood side by side in the snow for a moment longer, then parted without further words, like strangers who had shared a truth too intimate for names. That night, long after the candles had been snuffed out and the hearths had dimmed, Edward sat alone in his study, a letter open before him. His handwriting, once elegant, now trembled with emotion. Ink stained the corner of the parchment where his thumb had lingered too long. The letter bore no seal, no address. He had written her name. He had written of regret, of admiration, of a strange, impossible desire to know her better, not as a governess, not as a scandal, but as a woman of depth and dignity. He folded it once, twice, then set it in the drawer. He could not send it, not yet, but he could not throw it away. In the nursery the next morning, the frost on the windows had begun to melt. Alice and Beatrice were at the small table, heads bent over paper and pencils. For the first time in many days, the silence was warm, contented, filled with the quiet rustle of creativity. Lillian watched from across the room, sorting ribbons into a drawer. Beatrice stood suddenly and crossed the room, a drawing clutched in her hand. "For you," she said, holding it out to Lillian without preamble. Lillian took it gently. The sketch was simple, childlike but clear. It showed Lillian holding Alice's hand, standing near the fire. And behind them, in the doorway, the Duke, tall and watching, a faint smile on his face. Lillian's throat tightened. "Did you draw this?" Beatrice nodded. "That's how it felt," she said. That day, Lillian knelt and pulled both girls into a soft embrace. Outside, the garden remained white with snow, but in the hearts of those within the house, the first green shoots of spring had begun to stir, quiet, hidden, and full of possibility. The sky that evening was a living bruise, swollen and streaked in the colour of slate and storm. Thunder murmured above London like a warning too old to be heard, and the trees that lined the gravel paths of Wexham House moaned softly beneath the wind's breath. The air carried the scent of lightning before it had struck, metallic, sharp, and inevitable. The house itself seemed to sense what was coming. The children had been restless all day. Alice had clung to her doll without speaking, her eyes following shadows that moved too quickly across the walls. Beatrice, in a rare fit of frustration, had snapped a crayon in two and then apologized to no one. Even Lillian felt a heaviness pressing on her chest, the kind that precedes not tragedy, but change. The storm broke near twilight. Wind lashed against the shutters and rain hammered the windows like a frantic plea for entry. In the nursery, the fireplace glowed with low embers, and a small oil lamp flickered near the reading table, its light dancing with unease. The girls had refused supper, and Lillian stayed with them as they played half-heartedly with picture cards and tracing paper. She sat between them, her skirts spread out like a protective curtain, her voice steady as she read softly from a fairy tale neither child was truly listening to. The lamp, placed too close to the edge, trembled on its brass base. Then, in a moment too quick for breath, the wind shrieked through the cracks in the window frame. The curtains billowed, tugging the tablecloth, and with it, the lamp. It fell. The oil spilled in a flash. A spark caught the fabric. Then fire bloomed, not with a roar, but a terrifying whisper, as if the house had waited for this moment. Lillian acted before thought could intervene. She seized Alice in her arms and shouted for Beatrice, who had frozen with fear. The flames began to crawl up the edge of the drapes, licking the air with greedy fingers. Smoke poured upward, thick and choking. "Beatrice," Lillian cried, coughing through the heat. "Come to me." The girl did not move. Lillian turned, shielding Alice with her body, and lunged forward, grabbing the older girl's hand. Beatrice's eyes were wide, her lips trembling. Lillian pulled her toward the door, the smoke burning her throat with every breath. She threw it open, screamed for help, and stumbled into the corridor, with both girls pressed tightly against her. The hall was empty, the sconces dim, the storm outside roaring louder than the fire within. And then he was there, Edward. His coat was soaked through, his cravat loosened, his hair damp and disordered. He had returned earlier than expected from the city, his boots muddy from the garden path. He saw them, his daughters clinging to Lillian, her face streaked with soot, her arms wrapped around them like armor. Without a word, he reached forward, lifted Beatrice into his arms, and motioned for Lillian to follow. She nodded, clutching Alice to her chest, the child's tiny fingers gripping the collar of her gown. Together they ran, the smoke curling behind them like a wounded beast. It was not until they reached the south wing, far from danger, that they stopped. Edward set Beatrice down gently on a velvet chaise. Lillian lowered to the floor, with Alice still in her lap. The girls were coughing but safe. Lillian exhaled, and only then realized she had been holding her breath since the moment the lamp had fallen. Edward knelt beside her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice low, frantic beneath the surface. She shook her head. "No," They're safe. That's all that matters. He looked at her then. Really looked. Her face was pale beneath the streaks of ash, her hair disheveled, the neckline of her gown damp from the heat and the weight of 2 frightened children. But her eyes held something he had not seen before, something raw, something tender, something that broke him open and stitched him back together all at once. He reached for her hand without hesitation. His fingers closed around hers with desperate reverence. "You saved them," he whispered. She blinked, unable to speak. "They are everything to me," he said. "But tonight I saw something I've been afraid to admit." She said nothing. She could not. His hand trembled as it cradled hers. "If it were not for duty," he said, voice thick with something that felt like surrender, "I would ask you to stay, not as their nanny." She closed her eyes, the words cutting through her like silk through flesh. "And if I had the right," she replied, her voice just above breath, "I would ask you to see me, not as their mother's shadow." The words hung between them, suspended like the moment before a kiss. But no kiss came. Only the silence, only the storm, only the truth neither could bury any longer. A servant arrived moments later to inform them the fire had been contained, the damage limited. The nursery would need repairs, but the structure was sound. No lives lost. Still, something had burned, not just curtains or wood, something deeper, something essential. Later that night, in the quiet of the drawing room, Edward stood by the fire, staring into the flames. He held a ribbon in his hand, Alice's, left clutched in Lillian's gown. He ran it between his fingers like a memory he wasn't ready to release. And across the house, Lillian sat by the girls' bedside, watching them sleep. Their breathing was even, their cheeks flushed. They were safe, but her heart was not. Her heart was wide open and no longer hers. It began with a whisper, as all ruinous things do, a name spoken behind a gloved hand, a lowered voice in the corridor of a private club, a passing remark at a tea table where the china clinked too loudly. By the time the sun set on the second day, it was no longer a whisper. It was an echo. By the third, it was a storm. Lord Thomas Elridge, with his pristine boots and serpent smile, had loosed the past like a fox into the drawing rooms of Mayfair. He did not shout. He merely implied. He did not accuse. He only asked if others had heard the same. And with the precision of a well-honed blade, he severed the veil of discretion that Lillian Harrow had spent nearly a decade stitching back together with thread made of silence and dignity. "Such a shame," someone murmured at a soiree in Knightsbridge. "A reverend's daughter, was she not?" another said. "A suicide, yes. Or was it forgery?" No, she was engaged to Elridge himself. He left her. She never recovered. And now she lives in the Duke's house with his daughters. As what precisely? By the fourth day, the scandal had a pulse. At Wexham House, the air had changed. The staff moved more quietly, avoiding Lillian's gaze. Footsteps halted when she entered a room. Her breakfast tray was delivered late. The housekeeper no longer asked about the girl's appetite. Even Alice noticed, staring with wide, confused eyes when the kitchen maid refused to hand Lillian the bread directly. Beatrice, though silent on the matter, watched her governess with that same old guarded expression, too mature for her years, too sharp to be fooled. Edward, meanwhile, said nothing. Not to the staff, not to the city, not to Lillian. He spent his days in the study, emerging only to dine in solitude or attend to correspondence. His silence, once a balm, now became a blade. It sliced into Lillian's composure more precisely than Thomas Elridge's words ever had. Lady Margaret Ashcombe did not hold her tongue. She entered the drawing room 2 days after the scandal took root, her cane striking the marble floor like a gavel. "You must say something," she told her nephew. "You must act. If not to defend her, then to defend the house, your daughters." Edward stood by the window, his gaze lost in the skeletal branches of the orchard. He did not answer. "She is not a common girl," Lady Margaret continued, "but London will not care. They will reduce her to what she has endured. They will reduce you." He turned then, his eyes dark with something unnamed. "What would you have me do?" "Marry her," she said bluntly. He flinched. She did not relent. "Or cast her out. But you will not let her linger in this purgatory, not while vultures circle." Still he said nothing. Lady Margaret left him with only a warning. "You have never been a coward, Edward. Do not become one now." But the words did not move him. That night, Lillian sat alone in the nursery, the girls long since tucked into bed. The fire had burned low, casting the room in flickering shades of amber and grey. Her hands rested atop the storybook the girls had begged her to read earlier, but had fallen asleep too soon to hear. She stared at the hearth, at the shadows on the wall that looked like ghosts dancing. The rumours had reached her. She had known they would. She had known the moment she saw the butler's hesitation, the footman's averted eyes, the way the steward addressed her with formal pity. But it was not the whispers that broke her. It was his silence. He had not come, not even once. Not to ask, not to accuse, not to console. He had vanished behind his name, his lineage, his fear. She closed the storybook and tucked it into the shelf with shaking fingers. Then she rose. She moved without a sound, without a single tear. Her bag had already been packed 2 days earlier, a quiet act of self-preservation she had hoped she would never need to finish. She stepped into the girls' room like a thief. Alice was curled beneath the blankets, her hand resting atop the faded doll she never let go. Her mouth twitched in her sleep, as if whispering to someone in a dream. Beatrice lay with one arm flung across the pillow, her braid undone, her breathing even and slow. Lillian stood over them both, one hand covering her lips, the other gripping the back of the chair to stay upright. "I love you," she whispered, though no one would hear. "But I cannot stay." She turned toward the bookshelf, pulling out their favorite book, the one with pressed flowers tucked between the pages, the one they always asked her to read when the nights were cold and long. She slid a folded paper between the pages. A drawing. Alice's sketch of Lillian holding her hand, with the Duke watching from the doorway. A memory, a goodbye. Lillian brushed her fingers along the book's spine, then stepped back, closing her eyes to memorize the room. Then she slipped out. The house did not stir. The rain outside had begun again, tapping gently at the windows, as if mourning her in its own quiet way. She walked down the corridor with her bag held close, her shoes silent on the worn carpets. The portrait of the late Duchess stared down from the gallery, unchanged, unmoved. Lillian paused at the front door. For a heartbeat she expected a voice, his voice, to call her back, but the silence that met her was final. She stepped into the night, and the door closed behind her like the end of a chapter no one had finished reading. She told herself it was the right thing. She told herself her presence would only tarnish what the girls had rebuilt. She told herself love was not always enough. And in the black carriage that waited without escort, without farewell, Lillian Harrow left Wexham House. But a part of her remained behind, pressed between 2 pages, drawn in pencil and memory, waiting in silence to be found. There are absences that echo louder than footsteps, louder than voices, louder even than grief. When Lillian Harrow left Wexham House, she did not take her voice with her. She took the breath from the rooms, the colour from the morning routines. The stillness she left behind was not peaceful, it was hollow, and it swallowed everything in its path. The days grew longer, but the house felt darker. Edward Montgomery, Duke of Wexham, walked its corridors like a man hunting a ghost he would not name. The nursery remained untouched, the repairs to the burned curtains begun, but not completed. Her scent still lingered faintly in the fabric of the reading chair, in the lavender sachets left in the wardrobe drawers. The girls no longer sang. They no longer drew. They waited. Edward entered the nursery on a morning too bright for comfort, the air heavy with spring and regret. He stood motionless near the hearth, his hand grazing the worn armrest of the chair, where she had once sat reading tales of forests and spells, her voice low, calm, unshakable. The shawl, Her dark woolen one, with the stitched hem and one thread forever loose, remained folded on the back of the rocking chair. He touched it, barely. The softness of the wool was a cruelty. In the corner, Beatrice sat alone with a slate, though the chalk remained untouched. She looked up once, and then away. Alice was by the window, staring at nothing. Her doll, once sacred, lay on the floor at her feet. Edward's voice, when it came, cracked under its own weight. "Would you like to go to the park?" Neither girl answered. He lowered himself to one knee in front of Alice, gently brushing a stray curl from her face. She blinked. And then, after a silence so thick it could have been a wall, she whispered, "Where did she go?" His throat closed. He began, but the words would not obey. He was not prepared. How could he explain abandonment he had allowed? Through silence, through cowardice, through fear. He rose and left the room without finishing. Lady Margaret found him in the library that afternoon, standing in the golden shaft of light that broke through the stained glass window. "You let her go," she said. "I did not stop her," he replied, his voice brittle. "That is the same thing." Edward looked at the floor, unable to meet his aunt's eyes. "She loved them," she continued. "And you." "She never said it," he murmured. "She didn't have to," Lady Margaret snapped. "You saw it, you felt it, you feared it." "I didn't fear her," he said, his voice rising slightly. "No, you feared what you might become with her," she corrected. "Something more than a man buried beside a woman he cannot bring back." He looked away, his jaw clenched. "She was too noble to beg," Lady Margaret added, quieter now, "and too wise to stay where she was not claimed." That night, Edward dressed in silence. He wore a black cravat, not for mourning, but for defiance. He attended the House of Lords. He spoke briefly, eloquently about trade reforms he no longer cared for. He dined with peers at White's Club, laughed at a joke he did not hear. He was seen at the opera in a private box, lined with velvet and false intentions. He applauded a soprano whose voice could not fill the emptiness pressing into his ribs. He went everywhere, except home. When he did return, hours before dawn, the house greeted him with shadows. He poured a glass of brandy in the study, but did not drink it. Instead, he opened the drawer of his desk. The letter was still there, folded neatly, unsent, his name scrawled in his own hand. Her name inside, written again and again until the ink had pooled in the page's corners like tears. He opened it and read it aloud. His voice broke halfway through. "I admired you before I knew your name. I respected you before I learned your past. And I loved you the moment I saw you hold my daughters as though they were yours." The letter fell from his hands. He rose. There was no hesitation. The rain began as he mounted his horse, a steady drizzle that became a downpour before he cleared the gate. He rode without stopping, through the soaked streets of Bloomsbury, past shuttered bookshops and sleeping lamplighters, past hansom cabs with passengers who watched him with quiet curiosity, a duke wild-eyed on horseback beneath the London rain. When he reached the modest street near Russell Square, the gaslights flickered in the wind. The stone steps of the lodging house were slick with water. He dismounted, heart pounding, breath sharp in his throat. The windows glowed with weak candlelight. He climbed the steps and knocked. Behind the door, footsteps approached. He heard them pause. The latch clicked, and slowly the door opened. She stood there, Lillian. Her face was pale, framed by wisps of damp hair. A shawl clung to her shoulders. In her hands, she held a book she had clearly just been reading. She looked at him, not surprised, not expectant, just still. He removed his hat. "I came with nothing prepared," he said. "Only this." He reached into his coat and withdrew the storybook, the one with Alice's drawing folded carefully inside. He held it out to her. "You were never theirs alone," he said, voice unsteady. "You were mine too, from the moment you stepped into that house." Her eyes filled, but she said nothing. He continued, more certain now. "They don't want a governess. They want you, and so do I." She stared at him for a long, trembling moment, then took the book from his hand, held it to her chest, and nodded. Behind her the candle flickered. and the world shifted, not with thunder, but with peace. The rain had not ceased. It beat against the windows in frantic rhythm, like 1,000 desperate knocks from the past. In the dimly lit sitting room of the modest lodging house, the clock struck the 11th hour. The air inside was thick with candle wax and unresolved breath. The hearth had gone cold, though its ashes still glowed faintly beneath the iron grate. Lillian Harrow sat beside the fire, but not near enough to be warmed. A shawl wrapped her shoulders, but it was not the same one she had left behind at Wexham House. This one was thinner, unfamiliar, borrowed from the landlady who pitied her, but did not ask questions. No one in this place did. They glanced, they guessed, but they never spoke the names of ruined women. A book lay open in her lap. It was not the storybook. That one remained buried deep in her small traveling case, untouched, unread, too sacred to hold without shaking. Tonight, she read nothing. Her eyes traced lines but did not follow meaning. Her thoughts were a storm of unwritten letters and unspoken words. She had said farewell in silence. She had left without protest. But a question had rooted itself in her chest, like a splinter she could not remove. Why had he let her go? Then, a knock. Not timid, not loud, just sure. Her fingers froze on the page. Outside, the rain surged harder. A gust of wind moaned through the alley. The knock came again, once, twice. She rose slowly, as though pulled by something ancient. Her skirts whispered against the floorboards. At the door, she hesitated. She opened it, and there he was, Edward, drenched from head to toe, his coat heavy with rain, his gloves soaked through. His dark hair lay flat against his forehead, water streaming down the line of his jaw. His eyes, those pale blue eyes that had once looked at her with grief and distance, now searched her face with a kind of hunger, not of possession, but of truth. He did not speak at first. He simply looked at her, and she, pale and still, and wrapped in shadow, looked back. He reached inside his coat. From beneath the folds of damp wool, he drew out the storybook, their storybook, the one from the nursery, the one with the drawing folded inside. His hands shook. He did not offer a ring. He offered this. "I don't come with promises," he said softly, the storm pressing at his back. "Not of ease, not of peace, but I come with this." He opened the book. Inside, tucked between the pages, was Alice's sketch. Lillian, Alice, and Edward, watching. "You were never theirs alone," he said, his voice rough with restraint. "You were mine too, from the moment you stepped into that house." Tears welled in her eyes but did not fall. He stepped forward. The threshold between them was narrow but heavy. He continued, more certain now. "They don't want a nanny. They want you. Not because you are kind, or patient, or because you saved them, but because you saw them. You loved them without asking to be loved in return." He swallowed hard. "And so did I." Lillian's fingers brushed the edge of the book. Her lip trembled. "You should have said this before," she whispered. "I know. You should have come sooner. I know." She looked down at the book, then back at him. The storm roared, but they stood inside a silence more intimate than sound. "Do you know what they said to me the day I left?" she asked, her voice thin and broken. He shook his head. "They didn't say anything," she replied, "because they didn't know I was going. And because you never gave me a reason to stay." He lowered his eyes. "I was afraid," he confessed. "Not of you, but of losing the last part of her I still held on to." Lillian's heart stilled. "She would not have hated you," she said. "For letting someone else bring warmth back into that house. She would have thanked you." He looked at her again. The emotion in his face was unbearable. "I have been a coward," he said, "but I will not be one tonight." He stepped into the doorway, not to command, but to ask. She took the book from his hands. Her fingers lingered where his had touched the pages, then she held it to her chest and nodded. No kiss was needed, no vow exchanged, only the rain bearing witness as the door slowly closed behind him and the world began again, not with grandeur but with grace. The next morning, Wexham House stood bathed in soft spring light. The garden, once barren, now stirred with pale buds and trembling petals. The scent of hyacinths floated through the hallways. Inside, the girls stood by the drawing-room window. Alice was the first to cry out. "Miss Harrow!" She ran, barefoot and breathless, across the marble floor. Beatrice followed, more composed, but no less bright-eyed. Lillian stepped through the front doors, her cloak damp with the remnants of the storm, her cheeks flushed with wind and hope. The girls threw their arms around her. She bent low and held them both. Edward stood in the background, silent. Lady Margaret watched from the stairwell above, one hand resting on the banister. She said nothing, but her eyes were soft. Later that day, a footman was seen discreetly removing the late Duchess's portrait from the drawing-room, not to banish her, but to place her elsewhere, somewhere quieter, somewhere sacred. In the nursery, a fresh bouquet of violets stood by the windowsill. Beside it, the storybook rested open, with a new drawing tucked inside. This time, Lillian sat between Beatrice and Alice, her arms around both, and Edward, no longer standing apart, sat beside them, his hand resting gently atop Lillian's. No one signed the drawing, but everyone knew who had drawn it, and for the first time in years, the house felt full, not of echoes, but of love. Wexham House, spring of 1860. The gardens had changed. The hedges, once cut into rigid symmetry, now bloomed in looser, wilder shapes. Roses climbed higher along the stone walls. Lavender spilled over the gravel paths, humming with bees. There was less control now, more colour, more life. Wexham House was no longer a monument to grief. It was a home. From the upstairs nursery window, a voice, small and bright, shouted, "Mama! He's climbed the tree again!" A woman's laughter rang out through the open doors. Lillian Montgomery, Duchess of Wexham, stepped into the garden wearing a pale blue walking dress, her hair swept back beneath a wide-brimmed straw bonnet trimmed with violets. Time had softened her face, but not dimmed the light in her eyes. If anything, she shone brighter now. She looked up toward the great oak tree near the edge of the lawn. Sure enough, a 6-year-old boy with a head full of dark curls was perched among the lower branches, triumphant and wild-eyed, clinging to a crooked limb like a sailor to a mast. "Thomas Edward Montgomery," she called, hand on her hip. "I'm flying," he cried. "You're falling if you don't come down at once," she warned, though her smile betrayed her stern tone. A laugh echoed behind her. Edward, now 47, walked toward her with the same quiet command he had always carried, but with gentler lines around his mouth and less weight between his shoulders. He placed a hand on her back as he passed and called to the boy, "Come down, soldier. The Duchess has spoken." The boy grinned and began his descent. Nearby, under the blooming cherry tree, Beatrice, now 17, sat with a sketchbook in her lap. Her golden hair was pinned back with care, and her hands, though still slender, were streaked with charcoal. She no longer flinched from conversation. She led it. Beside her, Alice, 15, read aloud from a thick volume of Latin poetry, her voice fluid, confident. She was the quieter of the two, but no longer the most fragile. The girls who once whispered only to shadows now stood proudly in the sunlight, daughters of a house healed by patience and love. From the parlour window, Lady Margaret watched it all. Her hair was white now, her cane ever at her side, but she remained regal as ever. She had lived long enough to see everything she had once feared come to pass, and to see that she had been wrong. She had feared the gossip, but society changed. Whispers faded, the world moved on, and in moving on, it made room for something truer. After Edward's public declaration all those years ago, walking hand in hand with Lillian into the Mayfair Foundling Gala, London's high society had gasped, then whispered, then adjusted. Some turned their backs, others followed. Within a year, the story changed. Not about scandal, but about courage. About a duke who married a woman for love and raised daughters unbroken by grief. Lord Elridge, once the keeper of Lillian's disgrace, had tried to resurface with petitions and legal claims. But the tide of opinion had turned. He found himself shut out of salons, uninvited from clubs. His debts grew louder than his influence. By 1855, he had quietly sold his estates and vanished to the continent. No one mourned his absence. In the drawing room of Wexham House, the storybook still sat on the shelf, carefully preserved. Inside were 3 drawings, each folded between pages like pressed flowers. The first, Alice's rendering of Lillian with her hand in hers. The second, Beatrice's sketch of the family seated in the nursery together. The third, a recent edition, drawn by Thomas, in bold colours and shaky lines. It showed a tree, a house, a woman with a bonnet, and a man with a cane. Underneath, in clumsy print, he had written, "My family." One evening, Lillian stood alone in the garden, watching the sun set behind the hills of Kensington. The air was warm. The world was quiet. Edward found her there. He stood beside her in silence. "Do you ever think of her?" she asked softly, referring to his first wife. He nodded. "Yes, but not with sorrow." Lillian turned to him. "And me?" He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "With awe," he whispered. "And with the ache of every year I almost didn't find you." She leaned into him then, her head resting on his shoulder. They did not speak again for some time, because sometimes the truest declarations are the ones made long after the vows, in the quiet of shared breath, in the laughter of children once broken by loss, in the warmth of a home that had once forgotten how to open its doors, and in the woman who walked into that house, a stranger, and stayed as its heart. Some stories don't end, they echo. Lillian's journey began in silence, in shadows, in shame, in a house that had long forgotten the sound of laughter. But it became something much greater, a story of redemption, of courage, and of love that was not easy, not perfect, but earned. She was never meant to belong, not by title, not by birth, but she chose to stay, to heal what was broken, to raise others before she was lifted herself, and in return, she found something we all long for, a home where love speaks louder than duty, where the past is not a sentence, and where second chances bloom like wild roses in spring. This story reminds us that your past does not define your worth. True nobility is found in kindness, not in name. And sometimes, love knocks only when you believe all doors are closed. If you felt something while listening, if this story touched you, made you smile, cry, or remember someone dear, tell us in the comments. We'd love to know what you saw in Lillian's journey. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word home in the comments. That one word will tell us you were here until the very last line. If you wish to support the team that brings these timeless stories to life, you can now leave a super thanks on YouTube. Whatever amount you choose helps us continue creating these emotional journeys, and we thank you from the heart, truly. But if you can't support us that way, that's absolutely okay. Sharing this video with someone who loves historical romances is another beautiful way to help. And if you're not ready to leave this world just yet, we've selected other powerful stories for you. Just click on the cards we've left for you here on the screen. Thank you for being part of this story. Until the next chapter.